Computer. Everybody see in the top left corner it says recording? All right, Jim, I see you. Thumbs up. Okay, Keith Dixon told me that he never cuts his off. He said, I'll let the students mess with that when they get home. What's your name?
Tyree.
Let me see.
I misread the
What's to see now? Tell me your name again.
Tyree Blocker.
Oh, okay, there you're at the top. Okay. Did I send you the stuff though?
Yes.
Okay.
from last year.
Okay, and I got Garrison, Foster Garrison. Okay, I'll send you the number one. Did everybody get their syllabuses and the notes? Those of you who are taking it for audit, you should have got the set of notes. Again, the notes are being taken directly from the book. Now, sometimes you'll see, because you're seeing my notes, you'll see like a little F or and think of his name. You see a C for car Copino. And that means I'm taking something out of that book, but there won't be a lot out of that book. That's more just about Rome, ancient Rome. But Brother Ferguson has a very good book. I say it's a very good book. It's not put together good because it's all the back's already broke on mine. But it's got a lot of information on it, and plus it's written by a member of the church, and we'll use a lot of his material also. Again, those who are taking it for credit, you have to remind you to make sure that when you send me your notes, I'll send you mine, and you have supposed to give me 1 to 2 pages of typed what we talked about in class. You don't write. You don't have to send me everything the notes you took, but you get to use your notes when you take the final exam. So that helps. And if you take it for credit, you'll need the book, even though that most of the stuff I give you will be right out of the book. And we'll talk about some different things as we go through. Things do come up, and we don't have notes for those, but we don't, I don't write down the things in class to make test questions on those. And so again, the test will come directly from the book, from the main book. Okay. We'll talk about a number of things from these other 2 books and some other books that I have on my program, with my Logos program, by IVP. It's a varsity company that has all kinds of books on this. And so we read those too, or I do, try to. But we are on lesson number 2. We're talking about the didactic background of the New Testament. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll begin. Eternal Father, we're thankful again for the day and for our safe journey to this place. We ask thy blessings to be with us as we study this evening. We pray, Father, things we learn will help us have a better knowledge of the world in which Jesus lived and the apostles as they carried the gospel to the world. We pray, Father, for those who are sick, those who've lost their loved ones. We ask thy blessings upon the church throughout all the world, and all the things that we're doing to spread the borders of thy kingdom will be successful. We ask, Father, that thou will continue thy blessings upon us. In Jesus' name, amen. We have to close the door. Tommy's loud. He used to be over here behind me. He used to be over here behind me, and I'd have to close both doors. Okay. The thing is that it comes up that Jesus was a Jew. And I don't know, again, we mentioned this last week in closing, that when they made the movie, Mel Gibson made the movie, in reference to that Jesus, the Jewish people were kind of upset with that because of the movie pointed out that the Jews crucified the Son of God. Well, when we understand that Jesus was a Jewish person, as we would stop and think about it, his parents, as we understand now when we say his parents, that Joseph wasn't his real father, but we find that that Mary was of Jewish descent, and so was Joseph Jewish descent. When you read Matthew and you read Luke, you find that they include their genealogies, and in doing so, they show that Jesus' connection in no uncertain terms. And it just points that out to us. And so you have to be kind of careful in reference to looking at Joseph, because Joseph had somebody in there that was the son of Levi. And I was teaching one night and I made reference to that. And I said Joseph was he was the priestly tribe of Levi. He's not. He's from the tribe of Judah. And the fellow told me later, he says, I didn't know he was from two tribes, so you have to be careful sometimes. But the Gospels were written at a time, basically, that Christians were trying to establish an identity for themselves. Now, they wanted to be separate from the Jews, and we understand, and we have to understand, since we're talking about the exploring the New Testament world, that would include how that the Roman people would look upon that of the Jewish people. And then the Roman people, how they looked upon that of the Christians. And basically, we're going to see, because we're going to talk about all the different groups in the book. This is one thing that you won't have in the book. You won't have a section on the Samaritans. And so when you get my notes, you're going to have the section from Brother Ferguson's book, because I copied and pasted that and scanned it and all that kind of stuff and put it in my notes. Because I think we ought to have some kind of information about the Samaritans too, just like we did the Pharisees and Sadducees. So basically, there's this revolt against Rome in AD 66 to 73. And we understand, as we stop and we think about that, that also we had the destruction of Jerusalem that came about. And because of that, this great persecution there, that basically Judaism was completely over with. Saying that, the law of Moses ended at the cross. As the Bible points it out very plainly to us, Colossians 2 and verse 14. He nailed it to the cross, and basically when Jesus was about to die, he says it is finished. What was finished was the work that God sent him to do. And that was to basically he fulfilled that of the prophets. He fulfilled the law of Moses. He fulfilled those things in Psalms that spoke of him, Luke 24 and verse 44. And so it's very easy for us to come to understand that. But we find that from the day of Pentecost all the way to the destruction of Jerusalem, you still had the Jewish people, and they still had their high priest, they still had their temple, they still had their way of worship. And yet we would find also that as we read Romans to the book of Revelation, we have to remember that those books are written to Christian people. That is, people who are from a Jewish background, people who are from a Gentile background, and also a Samaritan background. And if you want to subdivide it, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Herodians, the Zealots, and all the others, all the other isms. And so we will look at all of those, and because it's good for us to understand what was going on from a religious standpoint among the Jewish people during the time that Jesus was upon the earth, but also to see what was happening after Jesus died upon the cross. And so the Jews, as we would say, wanted no part of the heretics, and that's what they looked upon, that of the Christian people who recognized an executed criminal as the Messiah. And so they won't have anything to do with it. And so there were 18 benedictions regularly recited in the synagogues. There was one which asked God to, quote, let the Nazarenes and the heretics perish in a moment. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. And so you can see the attitude that they had, the bitterness that was there, how they summed up basically that of anyone who was actually following after a man who was actually executed as a criminal. And so in reference to Jesus Christ. Even in the Gospel of John, many of those that are the scholars, they feel it reflects a decisive negative view of the Jews. I want you to realize that this book was not written by a member of the church, and he's going to say things that we will not agree with. And this is one of the things that we really don't agree with. What John actually tried to do was basically point out to them that you're still looking for a physical, earthly kingdom, and that's not what Jesus came to establish. And so Mr. Bell, he kind of says, well, that's a negative view of the Jews and typical Christians by the end of the first century. The earlier Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he says especially Matthew depicts Jesus as a sympathetic to Judaism. But again, I don't see him being sympathetic. I see him pointing out to them very bluntly when you turn to Matthew chapter 23, and you may want to turn there because we're going to read When you read Matthew chapter 23 there, that Jesus points out to them the type of people that they really were. And so I don't see it in a favorable light, but he points to them. He says, then spake Jesus to the multitude and his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, and all therefore whosoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. What does that tell you? That doesn't sound as if that he's speaking very highly of them. And so he basically points out to them in reference to them that they were people who they actually tried to observe the law, but also we'll find out that they had their own tradition, and they're going to follow their traditions before they'd even follow the law. Now, Brother Ferguson says on page 517 in his book, he says in reference to that, talking about Jesus, he had many friendly contacts with certain Pharisees. And he gives a number of verses like Luke chapter 7 and verse 36, beginning there, and then Mark 12, beginning verse 28, then here again in Matthew 23, beginning verse 1. And he talks about, Brother Ferguson does, he talks about that those verses, he says, nothing else should have made unnecessary the lesson many Christians have had to learn from Jewish scholars that Pharisee was not synonymous with hypocrites. Because again, they did go about doing certain things, but he does call them hypocrites when you go down through there and you read the whole 23rd chapter of Matthew. He points it out. But it was not just that the Pharisees were hypocrites. They was just the ones he was talking to. You had also the Sadducees, and we'll talk some about them also. But to understand more accurately what Jesus saw as his mission and why that the early Christians eventually separated themselves from that of the Jews, and we need to survey however superficially the state of Judaism is in the first century. We find that there's even a distinction that is made, and he's going to use a different word. I always call it dispersion. If you recall, the Jews had been dispersed. You know, remember when they went over to Babylonian captivity, they came back, they were dispersed everywhere. And that was called a dispersion. He calls it the dysphoria. And that's the word that's used in the book, and that's the word to be used in my notes. But I use the word dispersion. It makes me, I understand that, because that's what that word dysphoria means. Dysphoria. That they were spread out. There was a difference between those people that were spread out. Remember on the day of Pentecost, those different nations that come there? There's a difference in those people there and the people who lived in Judea. And we're going to find a big problem comes up in Acts chapter 6, because you have the people, the Hellenistic Jews, that is those people who are in the dispersion, they're there. And then we find also the Jewish widows from Judah and Jerusalem are there. And there's a distinction that's being made. And when you look at the Jews that were inside Judah and those Jews who were scattered, the Jews that were scattered had accepted the Greek language and the way of the synagogue life and some other things. And so that kind of brought some issues up between even the Jewish people. We're talking about they may have been Pharisees outside of Judea, but yet they weren't the same type of Pharisees that were inside Judea, because they had different things that they would hold on to. And so we have to make sure that we understand the distinction that's being made. Also in the book, he begins to talk about Judaism, and he's going to talk about the Hellenistic Jews, and then we're going to talk about the Judean Jews. Now, he states in the book, he says that Paul believed that in Christ there was no distinction between Jew and Greek. Galatians 3 verse 28. And that's basically, there is no distinction between male and female, Jew and Gentile, bond or free. There's no distinction that is made. So, but few of the Jews and Greeks or Romans of his day really agreed with it. Because here's this problem, if you recall, when you study the New Testament, what's the biggest problem that comes up in the church? And the biggest problem that comes up in the church in just about every one of the letters that's written to a congregation is a problem with that circumcision. And I thought it was kind of interesting, and it's pointed out in both these books, I think both of them point this out, is that those Hellenistic Jewish, the Gentile people, men, the women wanted to become Christians, but wanted to become the Gentile women wanted to be a part of the Jewish group. but the men didn't. And the reason for it is because, they had to circumcise them, and there was no such thing as, knocking you out. It was just that they circumcised. There was no anesthesia at that time, just to put you to sleep and circumcise. And so this was a problem among that of the Gentile people. And you'll find, for instance, we sometimes think about that of Timothy, that his mother was a Jewish woman, but she was married to a Gentile. But he was looked upon as a Jew because the lineage in reference to the mother refers back to that of the mother. So a lot of Jewish women would marry Gentile men, and the Gentile men did not want to become a proselyte because they had to be circumcised. And it's painful. I asked the doctor one time, I said, I was born and I was sent home to die. They said I wasn't going to live. So they didn't waste the time to circumcise me. So I asked this doctor, and I think I was, let me think here just for a moment. I was probably about 44, 45 years old. I asked him, he was a friend of our family, and I asked him, I said, Sammy, I said, how about my being circumcised? Maybe I need to be circumcised now, like that. He said, well, I can do that. He said, but you'll stay about 2 or 3 days in ICU. I said, that's all right. I thought it was just a simple thing. When he told me that I'll be staying 2 or 3 days in ICU, I said, I didn't have that done. Now, Brother Ferguson, in his book, pages 9 and 10, now I use the letter L for him, Ferguson. He says, as a result, in Roman times, the Apostle Paul, in writing to the church at Rome, could consider the cultural division in humankind to be Jew or Greek, or Jew and Greek, or more comprehensive, Jews, Greeks, and barbarians, Romans 1:16 and 17. He says, in the Hellenized population of Phoenicia could be called Greek, Mark 7 and verse 26, culturally, not radically. They'd be called that. So this situation was the result of a broader diffusion of Greek culture before, and that occurred. Any religious or philosophical movement would have been regionally or radically limited. Now, again, we have to remember that you have these Judean Jewish people that are strictly following, they're Pharisees, Sadducees, and all strictly following. But then you have those people again out in that dispersion. They were among the Greeks more so than the people around Judea, and so there were some influences that was up on them. And so the Jews were accused by the Greeks and the Romans of being aloof, separatists, priding themselves on maintaining their identity. We understand that, right? Because there was times when Jesus would confront them. They say, we're of Abraham's seed, because they were very proud of who they were. And so we have to consider the Jewish customs, and even though how perverse or maybe disgusting they may be, and claim that the Jews hate all others as they were the enemies of the Jewish people. That's how they looked upon that of the Gentile people. So here it is. The Jews were divided among themselves during the first century. The Apostle Paul was very intelligent. When he was captured there, he saw that part of them was Pharisees and part of them was Sadducees. He said, I'm a Pharisee. And he caused a problem among them, because even though they were together to try to do something to him, but yet all of a sudden when they found out he was a Pharisee, the Pharisees took up for him. And so there was a big problem. And so it was once fashionable to talk of the distinctions between the Jews of Palestine and those of the dispersion. The Jews scattered all across the Mediterranean world. James tells us about that in James 1 and verse 1, and also 1 Peter 1 verse 1. The picture was simple. Palestinian Jews were conservative, clinging to the Hebrew Torah, and untouched by Hellenistic influences. In other words, they hadn't picked up on all of those Greek types of things, that others had picked up on. And so they were just simply following the Old Testament way of the books of the Torah and so forth. And so those who would disperse were virtually indistinguishable from their pagan neighbors in appearance. In other words, if you were to go out in a dispersion where all these people were, and you'd see people, and maybe you were a Jewish person from Judea, you would see a difference between a Jewish person and a Gentile person. But now if you were to go into Judea, especially in Jerusalem, you would see a difference. And so because out in the dispersion, they were ignorant of the Hebrew. They used the Koine Greek. That was the language of the common people. And so they were willing to write new devotional literature in Greek, which eventually became the Old Testament Apocrypha. And with books like Tobit and First and Second Maccabees, they wrote those, but it was written in Greek. It wasn't written in Hebrew. And so today, however, it no longer appears possible to insist on such a clear-cut demarcation. Some of the scholars see Palestine itself as a Hellenized learning Greek customs and languages, and others are less certain. There is a new emphasis on the diversity of opinions among that of those who are dispersed Jews, and others would see the messianic fever of, as a connector between Palestinian Jews and those of the lower class Jews in the dispersion. And so Mr. Murray suggests in his book that there are new distinctions that need to be drawn up based on criteria other than geography. And so he uses the term Jew and the word Judaism for those who focused on the temple. In other words, when you read his book, you have to stop and think every time he says Jew, his talk or Judaism, he's talking about those who have themselves focused upon the temple. Those in dispersion, they focused upon the synagogue, because that's where they met. But yet they had all types of classes there and things of that sort. We'll talk about that at the synagogue, also reference the emphasis that it had in the lives of those who were dispersed. And not only that, but it was fixed. I mean, God had a plan, and we've always tried to get across to people that there is a plan that God has. And God, you remember the Bible points out to us in Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time. In other words, God has a plan. And that plan was, they had to have a place to be meeting. And so because of Babylonian captivity, they started the synagogues when they dispersed. Not only that, but they had to have one common language, and there was Alexander the Great that gave them the Greek. And many other things. All that had to come together for the gospel to be preached to all the world. And so he did have a plan, and this is a fulfillment of that plan. Now, there are other groups, such as the Essenes, who were, they were very, very critical of the priests actually managing the rituals within that of the temple. And Murray, in his book, he calls them the Hebrews. So you have the Jews, those who are focused on the temple. Then you have the Essenes, they're the ones that are critical of the priests, and they're called that of Hebrews. And so in a discussion that follows, we're going to use the category, we're going to call them the diasporial or the dispersion Jews and the Palestinian Jews. Okay? Even though that they are not clearly defined in every case that way, but basically so we can make a distinction between these two different groups. Now, the conservative Jews, such as the Essenes community in Palestine, practiced baptism for purification. What made the Palestine Jews different from the dispersion Jews, even if only to a degree, was the use of the Hebrew Aramaic language and the presence of the center of worship in that of Israel, the land of Israel. And so that was the distinction that was made. And so this doesn't mean that the Palestinian Jews didn't use Greek. It only meant that the Hebrew Aramaic language and the ways of thinking dominated in Palestine. Why we go about with those who are dispersed Jews had to be more aware of dominant Greek culture around them. They understood that. And I think if we come to understand that when Paul writes to the Romans, when he writes to the Corinthians, and he talks about this idea of eating meats and so forth, well, the Jews who has already been dispersed, they've already had to deal with that. But the Jews who are coming from Judah, outside of going from Jerusalem and out into those areas, they had not had to deal with that. And so here was a problem. And so they had to come along and solve those types of problems. As Paul pointed out to them, it's nothing in reference to that. So only when those distinctions were lost after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 did the ancient Judaism become actually unified, if you could say unified. But it was Palestinian Judaism which dominated, rejecting the Greek Roman world, which they had nearly destroyed. And so we'll talk about next, basically, we'll talk about the dispersion of the Jews beyond Israel. And it's called, like I said, diaspora, D-I-A-S-P-O-R-A, diaspora. But I say, to me, it should be diaspora, but dictionaries say it that way. But I call them the dispersion. It's easier to say that to me. The dispersion Jews were descendants of those people who were driven into exile. And so that means we have to go all the way back to the Old Testament, to that of Babylonian captivity, when they were driven, when Jerusalem fell in 586 BC. Some had gone to Babylon, others had gone to Egypt. Some had, such as the prophet Jeremiah, who was dragged unwillingly into Egypt, Jeremiah 42, beginning there, verse 18. After 538 BC, some of the Jews returned to Judea, began to rebuild the rebuilding process. And so, as recorded in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and others remained in their newly established homes. They didn't want to come back. And so the Egyptian Jews built another temple in the Nile, in the upper Nile, at Elephantine, or that's Elephantine, Elephantine, I think is what they say it. The Palestinian Jews were regarded as an abomination, and it was actually destroyed in 410 BC. So they had two temples. And so in 410 BC, we find that they destroyed that. When the city of Alexandria was established around 325 BC, many of the Jews migrated there. By the time of the birth of Christ, it was estimated at least a quarter of the city's population was Jewish, perhaps as much as 30% was Jewish. So the city was the home of one of the greatest Hellenistic Jewish thinkers, Philo, who lived between 25 BC and 41 AD. He was actually a member of a prominent family who served as an ambassador to under the Emperor Galaga, who was emperor between 12 to 12 AD to 41 AD, and he reigned March 18. I'm sorry. I can't read my notes. His nickname was from the Latin for little boots. And that name was given to him as a boy by the soldiers under the command of his father. And so his full name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. I have a hard time saying those words. So, yeah, many of the Jews that were spread around out of the Mediterranean, is little wonder that the Greeks and even the Romans became so aware of them and curious about their religion. So, now this is what he says. He says in the book, if the author of Acts is right, the author of Acts is right, the pagan literature does not refute him. The Greeks spent much of their time talking about new ideas, Acts 17, verse 21. And many of the Gentiles appear to have attended synagogue services. There was a place for them to meet. Now, some synagogues were predominantly the Hellenistic Jews, and they provided for the inroads of that of Christian missionaries. All we have to do is we go to Acts chapter 2, verse 17, and all of a sudden we read of all these different people that came to Pentecost. And then there are other passages that points that out to us. The Jews who welcomed Paul at Corinth in Acts chapter 18 bear suspiciously Greek Roman names. In other words, we have Titus, and then Justus and Crispus. And so those are actually more so Greco-Roman names. Now, Brother Ferguson, in his book, on page 550, he points out about the Gentiles. He says the Gentiles were not bound by the law of Moses, which was given to the covenant people alone. Talk about the Jewish people. He says, however, provisions were made for Gentiles to come into the covenant and assume the yoke of the Torah. The rest of humankind lived under the commandments given to Noah. The principle, he says, of the Noahic commandments given to the descendants of Noah is attested already in Jubilee 7:20. Righteous Gentiles who live according to their commandments could still have a share in the world to come, and this was considered the minimum requirements of the God-fearers. Now, we're going to talk more about the God-fearers. And so the idea is that there were 7 laws under the Noahic commandments. 7 laws are binding on the descendants of Noah, that is, establishing the courts of justice, prohibition of blasphemy, prohibition of worship of other gods, of murder, of incest, of adultery, of theft and robbery, and of eating the flesh of a living animal before it died. And so there were a number of things that they could not do in reference to that because of in reference to the Gentile world. They're following the laws that was given to during the days of that of Noah. And we understand that, or we should. You know, we get discussions sometimes about we're not under the 10 Commandments today. Somebody says, well, we're under 9 of them. No, we're not under the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments, there's 10 of them. They were given to the Jewish people. Now, those other commandments was given to Adam and Eve, or to Noah, if you want to stop and look at it. Because we're not under the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments would include that of the Sabbath day. We're not under the Sabbath day. It was the Jewish day. That it was a day that was given to the Jewish people for them to remember being brought out of captivity. There was a man by the name of Justice, and he's described by Luke as a worshiper of God. Now, a phrase that's used to denote Gentiles who attended the synagogue without fully converted into that of Judaism. These Jewish sympathizers, or we just made reference to them as God-fearers, had been the subject of a lot of controversy, but their presence can hardly be doubted. They existed, and some of them eventually even converted to that of Judaism. And basically what it was, like I said before, women converts went through an initiation. Is a ritual which may have had some impact on the Christian rite of baptism, but circumcision was actually the stumbling block for many males. And so sometimes it makes you wonder when you read, like the book of Galatians, and they're trying to bind that of circumcision on Christian people. And most likely those Christian people are Gentiles, because if they're Christians and they were Jewish before, they'd already been circumcised, and they're trying to bind circumcision on this here, since this Gentile man said, ain't going to be circumcised, because it was painful. It's a hard thing to go through. But yet Paul points out there, he says, whether you're circumcised or not, it doesn't mean anything. And I think that that's what we need to understand about some other things, like in Acts chapter 21. You remember Paul kept the laws of purification, but the laws of purification didn't mean anything, because the laws of purification was Jewish. And the Judaism law was completely done away with. And so here, they were God-fearers. And so the strictest interpretation of who is a Jew has long been that only the children of a Jewish mother qualify. There goes Timothy. See. The ancient writers rarely comment on anything distinctive about the appearance of the Jews. They looked differently only when they frequented the gymnasiums or the public baths, and where nudity was commonplace. And in those contexts, circumcision quickly identified the Jewish man. They knew who was Jewish. And so Jews in the dispersion developed some features in their faith, where their which their Orthodox people that were in Jerusalem and Judea saw a bordering on heresy. In cities around the Mediterranean, there are inscriptions that recorded participation of Jewish people in pagan cults. And sometimes they were officials. And we find that there was contact between that of the Jews and between that of the Greek people in the major cities, and especially like in Alexandria, because you had the big library that was there, and it was so extensive and intensive that the prevailing approach in Alexandria, Jewish apologetics, came to show that the Greek philosophers had borrowed from the Bible. That's what they would say. And we turn to Acts chapter 17. Who does Paul quote? He quotes their philosophers. And so the Jewish writer saw a connection between basically Moses and legendary Greek sage and poets and so forth. So there was one named Musaeus, and so they looked upon him as legendary Greek sage and a poet. So many of the pagan intellectuals were attracted to Jewish monotheism, and also some ethical practices that was being practiced among them. So the Jews spread up to other parts of the Mediterranean world, as well as to have some mingled with that of the pagan population where they went. And so there was this extension that was had previously been recognized. And again, we'll go all the way back. And again, when they were dispersed around 400 BC, there was a poet back then in around 30 BC named Horace, and he complained about the large number of the Jews that were in Rome. And he's writing a few years later, he mentions the synagogue as a likely place for a man to meet a young woman. Now, the dispersion Jews seem to have been eager to win converts, but there's a passage in Horace that offers some evidence of their aggressive proselyting, may point instead to their efforts to protect their their political rights. Because we will find that, well, we're going to find in reference to the Romans how that they allowed a number of things. Like they allowed money to be sent to Jerusalem for the support of the temple. And they did that to be counted as a tax payment. And so once the temple was destroyed, however, the government continued to collect the tax. Whether or not an individual paid it was one of the tests of his identity as a Jew. He paid. So there was all these different customs, and these customs were used widely. And there's Caesar Augustus. He used to joke, or he joked in a letter, that he was fasting like a Jew on the Sabbath. And Suetonius, in the historian Suetonius records for us. He obviously didn't understand what Jews did on the Sabbath day, but he could allude to their observation of the day and expect his readers to know roughly what he meant. And there were others who actually mocked the table manners of the Jewish people. Tacitus could talk about the Exodus account, and he would dismiss Jewish rituals and customs as deliberately contrary to the practice of the sensible people. And even the vocabulary that they used by a number of the Roman poets indicated a greater being familiar with that of Judaism than one might suspect. And so what happens is that everything's got, again, fall in order for them to be able to, for the gospel to be able to be spread in the time. And so that brings us to the Septuagint. Now, I don't use a lot of people will go, sometimes I go and look at words in the Septuagint. When I look at the Hebrew word, and I'll parallel it with that of the Greek word, and then look at the Greek word in the New Testament and so forth. Because you have to realize that the Koine Greek, and so here's the Septuagint that is going to be translated, and these widely scattered Jews considered themselves devout children of Abraham, and so they could not avoid the influence of the culture around them. By the time they had lived outside of Judea for a few generations, they come to speak a different language, and that language was that of particular the Greek. I said Alexander the Great conquest had spread Greek culture and the language all over the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's what they began to pick up on. That's what they would say. I got to go to Riga, Latvia when the Russian wall, or what do you want to call it, the wall was broken down. And you go in there, and the Latvian people, they could speak Latvian and they could speak Russian. And they could speak, some of them could speak English too. But once that wall broke down and they became an independent nation, they wanted to hear the gospel in Latvian. They didn't want to hear it in Russian. So we had two services. And when we'd get up and preach, and we'd have a group over here, an interpreter over here. He interpreted our preaching in Russian, and we had a Latvian over here, and he interpreted in the Latvian. Now, sometimes we would be preaching, and the Russian fellow would be sitting here translating, because the Latvians could understand. But the Latvian interpreter would be over here with the Latvian people, and then it'd be vice versa. The Latvian fellow would be up, he'd be on this side, because that's where the Latvians sit. They even sit different sides. Russians over here, Latvians over there. There were still a lot of problems there, and so, but that's the way that they did things. And so even though they could speak both languages, and so the same would be true here. But these dispersion Jews had picked all this Greek culture up, and so during the 3rd century BC, the Jewish scriptures were translated in Greek, and it was a process that began in Alexandria. And when they learned what was happening, Jews in Judea held a national day of mourning. That's what we're told by one of the stories that is told about that, because they considered Hebrew the only acceptable language for reading and studying the scripture. But this Greek version, eventually known as the Septuagint, abbreviated LXX, that's 70, capital L, capital XX, because it was done by 72 scholars. It became the standard for that of those people who were dispersed. And it's just as the King James became a sacred text in its own right for many people who could not read the Hebrew or the Greek original. And so some brilliant Jewish scholars, such as Philo, wrote extensively in reference to the treatise on the scriptures without being able to read the Hebrew. And so he claimed that the Greek version was a verbatim translation of the Hebrew, equally inspired, and simply shows his lack of familiarity with the Hebrew text. The Septuagint actually differs from the original in its reading in a number of passages. And in fact, there are three versions of the Septuagint. Eventually came into existence as it was copied, edited, and corrected by various people. A lot of people don't know that the King James Bible has been corrected and edited a number of times. And so the same is true with the Septuagint. The Septuagint is useful to biblical scholars today because it is based on a Hebrew text older than any copy of the Old Testament, which we have. And comparison of the Greek with the Hebrew can help in understanding and translating that of the Greek language. So these Jews that were dispersed, like Paul, he certainly was more comfortable with Greek than with that of Hebrew. Even in the book of Acts, we find that it claims that Paul studied in Jerusalem, Acts 22 and verse 3, under Gamaliel. Now, in saying that, Brother Ferguson points out, let us see, here on a couple of pages, page 112, he makes this comment, if I can find it. Well, there's two comments. Let me see which one I'm supposed to read first. I think it's 491 is probably the first one. He says here, let's see, 491. He says the corpus of rabbinic literature was shaped by the Hillelites. The leader of the school of Hilliah during the mid-first century was his grandson, Rabbi Gamaliel the elder, Paul's teacher, Acts 22 and verse 3. And he talks about, he says that it preserves the tributes to the outstanding rabbi, says that when Rabbi Gamaliel the elder died, the glory of the law ceased and the purity and absence died. Now watch this. He says advanced studies, now we're talking about advanced studies. We know, understand Paul was an advanced Pharisee person, okay? And the advanced study required that one attach himself to a great scholar. That's what Paul did in Acts 22 and verse 3. Or after the destruction of Jerusalem, to go to one of the academics, such as the one at Geneva. At this level, the student learned advanced scriptural interpretation and rabbinic legal opinions, the Talmud. And this study would prepare one for ordination as a rabbi or a religious scholar. That's after AD 70. One entitled to make legal decisions within the Jewish community. And now when we think about Paul, he attached himself, he was a student of Gamaliel. And he even points out that he was more knowledgeable than just about any of them. And so that's what would happen to him. Paul himself never mentioned this in his letters, even when talking about his zeal for the law in Galatians 1 and verse 14. So if we grant that he did study in Jerusalem, he must have known Hebrew, but when he refers to the Old Testament passages in his letter, he quotes the Septuagint. And sometimes we'll read passages. I'm trying to remember in the book of Romans there, he lists a number of passages, and he doesn't quote them verbatim, but he refers to them. And you go back and look at the Septuagint, and you can see what he has done. Those dispersed Jews may have known both versions of the scriptures, the Hebrew and the Greek, but Greek was the only one non-Jews could read. Now, you stop and think about that now. There was one language that everybody could read. What happened on the day of Pentecost? They heard them speak in their own language, their own dialect. Whatever dialect they were speaking, they heard it. But everybody that heard it in Greek. Well, why? They heard the gospel in their own language. And so when we think about the Judean Jews and used Hebrew only in the synagogues, in everyday life, they used Aramaic. A related Semitic tongue had long since become the spoken language of the land. When the New Testament says Hebrew, it really means Aramaic, like in John 19, verse 20. It was even necessary to publish Targums, Aramaic translation of Hebrew scriptures, a process that well attested by that of the first century. But again, Greek was so widely spoken in the first century AD that it might be more accurate to describe Palestine as a multilingual, as we see today. You know, we have a lot of people bilingual, but there would say multiple because they had different dialects. When I was in Vietnam, if I understand correctly, There are something like 23 to 26 different dialects. But you could take any Vietnamese, whether they be from South Vietnam or North Vietnam, and they start speaking that stuff, they can understand one another. But we have a lady at Cartersville that's she's from Spain. Then we have I had another lady that she was from El Paso. She married a GI out there, and her parents were Hispanic, Mexicans, and they could converse, but they had to watch what they say. You know, and I learned some few Spanish words when I was in school, and I said with them one day, and the girl from Spain looked at me and she said, "That's not nice." I said, "All I was trying to say was I'm here, I'm present, like that, you know." And she said, "That's not nice in the Spain Spanish." I said, "Well, we won't say that no more then." So you have to be very careful in reference to some of the languages and so forth. But Greek was widely spoken, and the Hellenistic influences had permeated many of the areas of life in Judea. And so the Jews fought the Maccabean revolt. If you read in between the testaments there, if you've ever had that course, we offer that course to the school. If they ever offered you, it's a good course to take. Around 167, 164 BC, to access this freedom from that of the king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who insisted that all his subjects worship the Greek gods. And so then there again comes into this idea that we're going to have Caesar worship. And so, but after winning the war, at least one family of the Jewish high priest began taking names like Jason and Menelaus, and which comes from that Greek mythology. And even the archaeologists have unearthed tombs of high priests and like the high priest Caiaphas and his family, and have found coins inserted in the mouths of the deceased, a Greek practice to pay for the ferry across to the river to the Styx of the underworld. You had to pay. In other words, they was paying for them to go on to their next place, as we would say. I guess the Catholics would say, what they say, purgatory, get out of purgatory and so forth. But even in the last throes of their flight for independence under the siege of that Masada, someone scratched something in Greek on the broken piece of pottery. And so they found those things. The Greek institutions, like the wrestling schools, that's not like the WWE, man. You know, but they had wrestling schools. They had bath houses sprang up in Jerusalem itself. The wrestling schools were built on the very temple hill. And the Jews seem to have attended those places regularly. And some were, now this is during the Maccabean period now, some were so eager to blend in with their Greek overlords and neighbors that they resorted to surgery to remove the evidence of circumcision. I don't know how they did that, but that's, and you had to remember again that they didn't have anesthesia and stuff like that back then. But they no longer wanted to, hide when they stripped to exercise or to bathe, as the Greeks always did. And so the details of the operations are spelled out by a Roman doctor, and in his medical book that they have. Herod the Great adopted a policy of deliberately Hellenization. That is, in other words, you become Hellenized, you pick up the Greek culture. And he staged games on the Greek model, rebuilt and renamed cities like Caesarea, gave children a Greek name, a Greek education, encouraged his non-Jewish subjects to participate in the imperial cult. Many of upper-class Jewish people adopted Greek Roman names and the customs of reclining on couches to eat their meals. So we can see some of that, when we look at the Last Supper. What were they doing? They were reclining, right? They weren't sitting in chairs. And so there are a number of things that, went on. Then you had Jesus. He came from a portion of Palestine called Galilee of the Gentiles, supposedly because of the predominance of non-Jewish elements. Matthew 4, verse 15. Fieldman argues that the Greek cities in the district were almost exclusively on the border and that the interior was unhellenized, the interior part. So on that interpretation, only the lower part of Galilee, where Jesus came from, appears to have been touched by Greek influence. A number of other fellows agree with that. But Jesus of Nazareth, however, was a product of Palestine alone. He was a product of Judaism, unaffected by any foreign admixture. You notice that Joseph and Mary, whatever they were supposed to do, they did it according to that of the Jewish law. Not only that, but they obeyed the Roman law. They were law-abiding citizens of Rome, as we would say. They weren't Romans. They weren't Roman citizens, but they abide by the law. There were many Gentiles in Galilee, but Jesus was in no way influenced by them. And even in his days in Galilee, as was the stronghold of most of the enthusiastic Jewish patriotism, and he spoke Aramaic, and there's no hint of that he knew Greek. But again, we're talking about the Son of God. The excavation of Nazareth began in 1983, and it indicated a great Greek influence pervaded Galilee to a degree that scholars have not previously suspected. And so it's highly unlikely that Jesus could have been totally untouched by being in contact with that of the center of the Greek culture. And so there is also a middle ground. Another writer has shown that the Jews of Judea regarded Galilee as less purely Jewish than their own area. And so they had these two districts were separated geographically by Samaria. And so that leads us also that we need to understand something about Samaria. And therefore, there was difficulty in the direct communications between the upper and the lower because of that of Samaria. And so the people of Galilee seem to have been devoted to Jerusalem's temple cultists. Even if we stop and think about the Pharisees and the teachings of the Pharisees among them. And so they actually did not dominate the way it did in Judea, that is, the teachings of the Pharisees. It was the decided unpharisaic quality of Jesus' teaching, which is emphasized, his emphasis on his personal authority that made him so popular with the people, Mark 1 and verse 22, especially of Galilee, and still makes some Jews uncomfortable with them even to our day and time. Okay, in spite of, there are others that talks about in reference to that of Jesus, that is other historians as they write, he says, one fellow, Clausimer, he says that it's highly likely that Jesus spoke Greek. So you have, even though we're exploring the New Testament world, and we look at these historians who have done all the studies, and you have one that says most likely he didn't, then you have others that says yes, he did. But any tradesman in that area would have needed at least a working knowledge of the language to survive. And you got to remember, what was Jesus? Joseph was what? A carpenter. So therefore they, built things and done things of that sort, as we would probably say construction work today. So probably a large number of those Greeks were bilingual, that is Greek and Aramaic inscriptions are found in Palestine over and over again, and they could read and probably write that of Greek, and probably did so for strictly that of family businesses. But again, when it came down to that of their worship and so forth, if you were a Jewish person, again, you used the Hebrew language. Josephus says that knowledge of Greek was more common among the lower class people. Now, again, remember, we said that Jesus spoke, the common people heard him gladly. And so when we stop and we think about it, he himself had to have assistance, help in his writing, that is Josephus, because he normally spoke Aramaic. And so most of Jesus' teaching in Judea was more likely to have been done in Aramaic also. So some scholars see his vocabulary and also his sentence structure as Aramaic origin for his parables and some of the other things, the sayings that he used. And others suspect that he was influenced by the performances in that of the Greek theater. So again, it's just what historian you read. Pilate, and you think about Pilate, he was educated, a Roman educated, and he would have spoken Greek fluently, but Latin was the official language of the empire. And you remember when he put the sign above the cross, he put it in all three languages. And so under normal circumstances, both sides could have used that of Greek, but for official purposes. Now, when Jesus was crucified, as I said, he put it up there in Latin and Greek and Aramaic, John 19, verse 20. We're going to take a break because I want us to go to Acts chapter 6, because here's where we find basically the difference between, a difference being shown after people obeyed the gospel between that of the orphan women. Okay? So we'll take a 10-minute break. Means I got 7:29, so 7:39, 7:40. Any questions? Y'all awake?
Mm-hmm.
I heard Jim snoring. Lawrence is not on there. I think he's asleep. Him and Benjamin both.
Not yet.
All right, I'm gonna let this thing keep running. So if y'all talk, it'll be on there.
I ain't asleep.
No, you're not asleep, Benjamin.
You might want to slow down because I could hardly hear everything you were saying.
Well, you need to turn up your computer.
No. I mean, you were talking too fast.
Oh, talking too fast. Well, you need to put your mind in second gear. You ought to be in my biblical archaeology class. I have to do 70 pages every night.
Wow.
13 weeks. Rough.
Yeah.
I never thought it for you.
How is, by the way?
Garrett,
Nice to
meet you too. He is talking a little fast, right?
Yeah, a little bit. I don't rank it.
All right, so far.
Living in the area, from this area.
I live over the other side of Marietta, down Sandy Plains, right in 92.
Wait, 92 runs all the way over there?
What's that?
92 runs over there?
And that was really good, yeah. Keeps on going. I don't think 92
Yeah,
had
that
it.
was very good there.
Yeah, it's right where Marietta and Woodstock and all that. So,
Okay.
Roswell rather, but yeah, they all kind of hit right where Sandy Plains and 92 hit around Sandy Plains and Marietta to the left on 92. Woodstock and go right here around. You live around here?
Yeah, I'm in Hackworth.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I grew up in
Three Musketeers, Milky Ways.
Yeah, I'm
Mini
trying to see
thing.
if I got any change.
No, they're free. It's a little bitty.
Oh, there are?
Yeah, Lawrence. Keep Lawrence. Brought him here the last quarter. He bought a bunch of Halloween things. Didn't know about it. Yes, what?
So I need to send you just that link.
Yeah, that way. Just
Like I said, I'll send you I know y'all doing a lot of writing now. You're gonna get the notes. You know, you'll get my notes once you send me what you do. So like I said, a lot of people don't buy the book.
Mhm.
But since this is my first time ever teaching this,
Was it this book and that book? Is that?
this is the textbook. This right here was a suggested another reading. I think this is the better book that's written by me in the church.
Okay.
And he spends a lot of me. Like I said, I didn't broke the back on this one.
Okay. Okay.
You know, just he really goes into a lot of it. He quotes from this book.
Oh, really? All right.
Yeah, he quotes him, and Brother Ferguson done a great job in the book. I thought he teaches this somewhere. I don't know if it's Harding or somewhere else. But I'd already bought both books, and I started reading this, and I said, I wish that I just bought this book right here and just outlined the book. But there's so much quoting from the historians and quoting from uninspired literature, you know, the historical Maccabees and stuff like that during the Book of Testaments, and so that's where they get a lot of information.
Okay.
And so then it's all some of those conclusions that we draw from just reading the New Testament about some of the Pharisees and Sadducees and all that type of stuff, that they attitudes and so on. But he does a good job, I think. Like I said, I broke down this there,
Okay.
but it's 600. Well, you see where I've gone through, so they marked this one up in the back.
Mm-hmm.
To parallel with that over there, but I don't have time to read all this stuff. Everything I got marked is in that book there, and I spent a week doing that. So I'm just reading all through the book.
You said all three?
Yeah,
Is this another one?
yeah. This is just ancient Rome on the Rome later lives and so forth. And it's pretty good, but like I said, you know, it's just like reading like a novel. But
Okay, general history.
yeah, when I went to this one also, I looked back in the back and started looking, and I just went through his book, and they had some of the same stuff, and I said, well, I'm not gonna mark this thing anymore. And I was gonna mark it up too, like I did that one as I was reading. I ordered those. I found those online for $7 or $8 a piece. I think.
Okay.
You can find them. Is that a solid white cat?
No,
No, he's a Turkish van.
Oh,
He's got some orange.
orange of it. We had solid white ones. He was 20 years old when the dogs caught him.
Oh no.
He couldn't move much in fast, you know. My son took care of the dog though. The dog didn't catch any more cats. It wasn't our dog, it was somebody else.
Our last cat lived to like 19, so we're hoping, no offense, he doesn't quite live that long. He's nine now.
You get attached to him, I know that. We got attached to her. We got one now. She's about the sorriest thing, but we're attached to her.
We keep trying to give him away, but nobody will take him.
Yeah. We got 3 dogs if you need one.
Oh.
Okay, let's look at Acts chapter 6. Now, I mean, we talked about all these different things as the difference between in reference to the dispersion Jews and the Judean Jews. And so in Acts chapter 6, the Bible points out to us that here's this problem that comes up, and the gospel has gone, and basically they're preaching and teaching the gospel just in the city of Jerusalem and Judea. And so what happens is that a lot of the people that had come to Jerusalem for Pentecost didn't go home. And that caused a lot of other problems. You know, they had to have food and clothing and shelter. And so that caused some problems. And so here we find, he talks about in chapter 6, he says, in those days when the number of disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmur of the Grecians against the Hebrews. Now, the Grecians would be those who dispersion, and the Hebrews would be those from Judea, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. In other words, they weren't being taken care of. And so then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them and said, it is not reason that we should leave tables, leave the word of God and serve tables. Wherefore, brethren, look out ye among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost and wisdom, whom you may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word. And so they choose 7, and they set them over this work that's going to be done there. Now, when we think about that, we find that Brother Ferguson, he makes this point in his book on page 569. He says, according to the Mishnah, a court of 3 judges is required for judicial decisions in cases involving property. Now watch this. Several sources refer to the 7 of a city who ruled a city, functioned as judges, and had charge of financial affairs. That's according to Josephus. And let's see, a couple of cases require a court of 23. These were called a lesser Sanhedrin and were located in the larger towns throughout Palestine. A city was required to have 120 men in order for it to have a lesser Sanhedrin. The greater Sanhedrin in Jerusalem had 71 members. And the point that he makes is that, you know, these sources, several sources, refer to the 7 of a city who ruled a city, functioned as judges, and had charges of financial affairs. That was in Josephus' book. And so the thing is was that type of influence upon the apostles said we need 7 people, you know, because that was basically a custom among the Jewish people, choosing 7 people to be over those types of affairs. And so this dispute came up. So here it is, they're having this dispute. So to keep peace, these 7 men, all with good Greek names, were appointed, and Mr. Bale says deacons. I don't know if they're deacons or not. They were doing the work of a deacon, and so that's what we usually say. They were ministering to these widows. But even more interesting is that when you drop down and you read down in verse 9 here, he says, then there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertines and Cyrenians, and Alexandrians, and them of Cilicia and of Asia disputed with that of Stephen. And so also Brother Ferguson points out in reference to that, and he has a picture, and I know that you probably can't see the picture, but I'll stick it up there. At the very top page there, he has a picture of a synagogue, and it says the synagogue inscription in Jerusalem. says, Theodius, a priest and ruler of the synagogue, set up this inscription to commemorate his building of a synagogue for those who came to Jerusalem from abroad. Acts chapter 6 and verse 9. So the idea is that here they had a place for them to meet. Now again, remember the Grecian people, Jewish people, that's how they worshiped in synagogues, because they were not able to go to the temple like everybody else will go to the temple. So they were able to worship in the synagogue. So it actually mentions that these Jews were from various synagogues. And so they began to, again, dispute with that of Stephen over the Christian message. Now, their synagogues bear revealing names there, you know, of the, when you stop and you think about the Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and others of those from Cilicia and also Asia. So Aramaic, however, was still the native language of the people, and most business in the street was conducted in that tongue. When Paul was thought to have violated that rule, he was mobbed and only barely was rescued in Acts chapter 21 by the Roman soldiers. And so this tribune in charge seemed surprised that their prisoner would speak that of Greek. And so Paul then asked to address the crowd, and he did so. When he spoke in Hebrew or Aramaic. And so it's understandable that when we look at beyond that, they have this group of people in reference to the synagogues and so forth. And as Paul was going around, places he would preach would be in the synagogues. And so they basically used the Greek, but here he would use, at times, we would say the Hebrew and the Aramaic. The Judean Jews struggled to retain their identity. And I think this is one of the problems that we see when we read the New Testament. They're struggling with their identity. You know, if they could keep converting people as they were converting people to Christianity, then there's no longer going to be any Jewish people left. And so they were facing a number of challenges. And so they were not about to let a lone individual like Jesus Christ, a criminal as they looked upon, subvert their faith that they had struggled so hard for and longed to preserve. They weren't going to let that happen. And that was a motive that was behind them. And so they tried the very best way they can to stop that. And so that's the reason why Paul's in trouble, and the others also got in trouble. Now then, another part in the book that he talks about is oral tradition in Judaism. When we studied the New Testament, basically, if we were to say that if we were living at the time of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they were with Jesus, then all that was spoken. And then up about Acts chapter 13, everything was spoken, and all of a sudden the books began to be written of the New Testament somewhere in those areas. And so students of the New Testament often encounter reference to the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H. Now, Brother Ferguson, I want to just go over here, and I don't, spend a lot of time in his book, but he does just an excellent job in talking briefly about the references to that of the Jewish writings. Like he talks about in pages 493 to 495 about the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah originated around 200 or shortly thereafter. It comprised 63 tractates arranged in 6 divisions in order, dealing respectively with laws pertaining to agricultural produce, that is seeds, the holy days and festivals, set feasts, women, property rights, and legal proceedings, the holy things related to the temple, the hallowed things, and uncleanness and purification. They are thus concerned in order with the holiness of the land of Israel, the holiness of time, proper conduct on the holy days, the holiness of a family life with special references to the transfer of women from the father's house to the husband, the sanctification of property, the state conduct of civil life, the holy place, stable conduct of the cult, and the bonds of holiness, purity in an unholy world. The Mishnah thus focused on the sanctification of Israel, distinguishing her from the world and establishing order and stability. Now, when you stop and you read the New Testament, you'll find, like Paul, when he writes to the church at Thessalonica in chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, one of the probably the best writings that Paul did, and again, he wrote by the Holy Spirit, we understand, but about purity and sanctification. He deals with that. It's basically like some of this.
You said it originated
200 BC?
200 BC.
How many tractates?
It had, let me go back, 63 tractates. T-R-A-C-T, T-R-A-C-T-A-T-E-S. Yeah. And basically, the Mishnah is concerned only with life lived in the Holy Land. Now, get that. That's Judea. It leaves out the dispersion, okay? You have to remember that. It leaves out the dispersion. So that in large measure accounts for older scholars making a sharp distinction between Palestinian and dispersion Judaism. And for those who had studied Judaism primarily through the Mishnah and related materials, taking it to a normative for all Judaism. Now, he also mentions, and this is mentioned in the book, he talks about the Talmud. And also, again, he does a good job talking about the Talmud. He deals with actually all of the writings of the Jewish people in his book. He simply says the Talmud, the Mishnah plus the Gemara, that is the completion, equals the Talmud. Thus, the Talmud includes the text of the Mishnah by sections and commentary on it. And then he talks about the, I hope I get this right, H-A-L-A-K-A-H, Halakha, H-A-L-A, Halakha, H-A-L-A-K-A-H. And he talks about it, and this is what he says. I have to find, here it is. More specifically, the Mishnah is a codification of the Halakha. The verb halakha means to walk, and halakha refers to an authoritative legal decision on how one was to conduct himself according to the law. Note, now he makes this point, Brother Ferguson, note the frequency of to walk in the practical, ethnical sections of the New Testament epistles. Like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 1 is one of the passages he gives. So, go ahead.
Good question. So, the mission of the Talmud and the Halakha, they were, was that from the law? Was that all?
Well, it was.
They derived it from the law.
Yes, right. Derived it from the law. They're like commentaries. The commentary on the Mishnah was called the Germa, G-E-M-A-R-A, or what we call to complete. And so you put the Mishnah and the Germa together, and that's what they would call the Talmud. Okay? And then when you look at, you read the Talmud, he would also have, they would have the codification of the Halakha. That was simply, here is the way that one is supposed to conduct himself. And so you read all of these different things. They had all kinds of types of writings there. They tried to, every way possible, to interpret that of the Old Testament. And so as an oral tradition among Jewish scholars of antiquity held that Moses began a process of actually explaining the meaning of the law. And so noted scribes like that of Ezra, if you recall now, when you read Ezra, were believed to have passed along this body of oral teaching, as they call it. Now, you can buy some of these books. I'm trying to remember the one we have at the church at Cartersville. I think it's the Talmud. Okay, just stretching. Okay. Since the Jews of the pre-Christian era had not settled on a canon of sacred books, since they had not adhered to a literal reading of their scriptures, they could dispute the meaning of any passage. And so the interpretation given by a majority of the rabbis was supposed to be binding, but the minority opinions was also preserved. So now you stop for a moment and think about that, and all of a sudden here Jesus appears, and you have this great division among the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and all these other groups, you know. And he tells them, he says, you know, you got your tradition. They were holding on to those things. They was holding on to the interpretations that were given. That's what they were holding to. But they would pick and choose. And therefore, that's what Jesus would say in Matthew 23, verses 1 through 3 there. You know, he says, do as they say, not as they do. Because they would quote the law right, but they wouldn't carry it out the way it's supposed to be carried out. And so he deals also with, let me see here, on page 492 in this book, he goes on. I'll have to look, oh, here it is. The commentary on the Mishnah was called the Gemara, from the verb jamar, to complete. Now, the Amoraim speakers, what they call them, were commentators on the Mishnah of Rabbi Judah. And he talks about those in, Brother Ferguson does in his book. He talks about those who are what they call speakers.
and they were just a group of rabbis. And they actually created this German commentary on that of the Mishnah. And so the Mishnah and the German were combined, and in the 5th and 6th centuries into the Talmud, another word meaning study or instruction. And then the Talmud existed in 2 versions. They had the Babylonian, and then they had the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, my understanding is that the Babylon Talmud is about 4 times as long as the Jerusalem Talmud, and is generally recognized as the Talmud. And so another category of interpretive material not included in the Talmud is the, all right, let's see if we can get this one now, Midrashim, Midrashim. And those are commentaries on various biblical passages, primarily from Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the book of Psalms. And so these sometimes take the form of legal prescriptions, sometimes of sermon-like explanations, and the dates of those things around the 12th century AD. And so it's where they continue to give the interpretations of the old law.
How did you spell it?
Midrashim. But a major problem in using any of the Talmudic or the problem in using them was that in the study of the 1st century Judaism is that one cannot be certain of the date of the origin of any particular passage. And so an opinion attributed to one rabbi may have been merely his statement of a view. And that's what happens on the subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. In the New Testament, they quote from 2 different these groups. Some people do. And they're trying to prove in reference to what the Bible teaches on marriage, divorce, and remarriage today. But this material also reflects a concern with Palestinian Jews and not with those who are dispersed. And so that was a problem. And so if we keep that in mind, when we read Romans and other passages, other books, if we keep that in mind, that here's Paul, he's writing to the church at Rome, never been there, but he's writing to them, and he's talking to them, and you see all these problems, some of the problems they're having. Remember, people are coming and going, especially to Rome. And the church at Corinth was made up of that of Jewish people, that is, those of the dispersion, and that of Gentile people, and they had problems. But they had some real severe problems when it came to the Jewish people from Judea. You remember, go back to Acts chapter 15 when they have to come and discuss the laws of circumcision, and James and the elders there writes that epistle and sends it out. It has to be read. So they had some problems. And so more important for students of the New Testament are the Targum, or the Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew Scriptures. And he also, in this book of Brother Ferguson, he deals with that. It's basically, about to lose everything. This Targum, Targum, an important source for the way in which the Hebrew Bible was understood, is found. Targum is the plural, Targum. As knowledge of biblical Hebrew declined, the custom arose following the scriptures reading in Hebrew in the synagogue with an Aramaic paraphrase. The Targums, they preserve the way passages were commonly interpreted and stand midway between a literal translation and a longer midrash commentary. Since the people often remember passages best according to the way they were paraphrased, it is not surprising that sometimes the text was quoted according to the meaning given in the Targum rather than according to its actual wording. Thus, Ephesians 4 and verse 8 cites Psalm 68:18, according to a form known as to us from the Aramaic Targum and the apparently related Syriac translation of the Psalms. And so you can see how important, or how they these writings, how the importance they were in that of the lives of that of the Jewish people. And so that brings us down to the different factions among the Jewish people. Be the next point. Even in their struggle to preserve and transmit their faith, the Jews were split into several factions or parties. And one of the scholars calls it a society divided by religion.
And Christians tend to think just of the Jews. I mean, that's what we think, without realizing that they were divergent, and they even conflicted in their points. We understand it between Pharisees and Sadducees because it's always pointed out. Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. Pharisees do. Sadducees don't believe in spirits and angels, and we would find that the Pharisees do. But there were some others that was also there, and so we have to look at all of those. And so we would find that there is this divergence. There's these conflicting viewpoints, even within that of Judaism, and the same is true today. And so instead of the monolithic Judaism, it might be more accurate to talk about the multiple Judaisms. And so putting it more positively, one scholar has described Judaism in the New Testament period as, and I quote, so alive, so progressive, so agitated by controversies, that under its spacious roof the most contrasting views could be held until a greater uniformity was reached after AD 200. That's how bad they. Most of the parties of the first century of Judaism are mentioned in the New Testament, and so it'll help us to, look at those. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to spend the rest of our time today to look at some of those. We're going to look at all of them because they're very important for us to actually come to understand. As I remember a fellow told me, said, yes, I studied that you used to call this a different course and name. And he said, man, we learned about them Sadducees, they sad, you see. And that's what he said, sad, you see. And the Pharisees, all those. And so that's what we want to look at. But now, those differences were extremely important while the Jews enjoyed their existence as a nation. When we read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we usually are very specific when they mention a certain party of the Jews opposing that of Jesus. But then when Paul's missionary work spreads into that of the Greek world, okay, we find Christian writers making a broader contrast between Jew and Greek. Now, again, that's because just if you get the mindset of Judea, just think about Jerusalem and Judea, their focus was on the temple, and then you had all these others outside. Their focus wasn't on the temple like that. And not only that, they had picked up all the Greek culture and the language and that type of thing. And so there was difficulties between them that way. And you can imagine that here is one who has been brought up in that Greek culture, and he's going to go to Pentecost, or he's going to go to the Passover, or whatever it may be, to the temple in Jerusalem. And some of the things that they would see. To outsiders, the disputes seemed like Gallio said in Acts 18:15, the Revised Standard Version says, a matter of questions about words and names in your own law. That's what he said. So as we look at these groups, we have to realize that they constituted Judaism in Jesus' day. And so we should bear that in mind, that they represent different approaches to that of religion, which might be found in any tradition. For instance, the Sadducees, they emphasize formalism and devotion to the temple and its rituals and the strain which survived in Palestine even during the exile. And when we say that basically the Sadducees were in control in the first century of nearly everything because of that. The Pharisees were typically of a group which tried to adjust to changes, the change circumstances. When the Jews did not have the temple during the Babylon exile, they developed synagogues. And not only that, they had teachers to instruct the people. And after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, they focused on study and transmission of the Torah and its interpretation. And the term Pharisee may not have been used after AD 70, but the approach of the rabbis was still the same. It was to teach and to instruct that of the people. Now, when you come around with the Essenes, we'll talk more about them, but there was aesthetics, emphasizing that this idea of self-denial, self-discipline, and demanding more themselves than most members of their larger religious groups did. There is this Sicarii, and the Zealots, and they were radicals. And those were unwilling to accept any compromise in their beliefs, that only God is Lord over Israel. And so these approaches to Judaism appear to have existed throughout its history, although the groups which embodied them may have been called by different
names are even different, even at different times. In other words, they may be called something, then all of a sudden their name changes. And so it's we can trace though the Sadducean and the Pharisaic attitudes back into the Old Testament times, even if the groups were called by names, other names in the New Testament. And so they don't have a long history, but the Sadducees do. The word Sadducees is mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 times in the New Testament. I meant to count them before I come to class. Now, starting at the top of the social scale, as we think about them, we encounter first this group, as we said, Sadducees, and because most likely now, I say most likely, they descended from David's high priest Zadok, 2 Samuel 8:17, or perhaps from the word that has the meaning, it's Sadik, that meaning righteous. And so they took an ultra-conservative stance. When we look at them, they only took the Torah, that is the first 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and refusing to sanction any doctrine not explicitly taught within those 5 books. Now, they could not deny the existence of angels which appeared in the Torah, but they were cool to elaborate beliefs about angels and demons that flourished in the period after the Babylonian exile. They did not see the resurrection in the Torah, though it may be there, Hebrews 11, verse 19. Thus, they rejected belief in the resurrection either in the form of angels or spirits, according to Acts 23, verse 8. Now, knowing that would help us to understand why the Sadducees come along in Mark chapter 12, beginning verse 18. They came and asked Jesus the question about the woman married to the 7 brothers in succession. Then they asked this question, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? They didn't believe in the resurrection. So why are they asking such a question to Jesus the Christ? Just try to trap him. And so when the Sadducees later attacked the apostles for preaching that in Jesus there's a resurrection of the dead, Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5, they didn't believe in his resurrection because they rejected the general notion of the resurrection. So Paul was able to create a distinction between them in Acts chapter 23, beginning in verse 6, because of his voice and his belief and that of the hope of the resurrection. And so that's what they believed. The Sadducees had little contact with the ordinary people of Judea, and they had no concern with popularity. They didn't care if they were popular or not. Josephus said in his book, War 2, page War 2, paragraph 166, I think. He says, even towards each other, they, Sadducees, show a rather harsh spirit, and they treat others like themselves as rudely as they do foreigners. So in another passage, he says, they have the support of the rich only, but no following among the masses. The Pharisees, on the other hand, enjoy popular support. So the Sadducees then were their aristocratic, highly priestly group concerned about exclusively with running the temple. And after it was destroyed in AD 70, guess what? They disappeared from history. Unable to adapt to the changed circumstances in which Judaism had found itself. Because in the destruction of Jerusalem, that temple was completely wiped out along with everything within it, also the genealogical chapter. So therefore, they were completely destroyed. They just could not handle that. Then on the other hand, and again, in this book by Brother Ferguson, he deals with these in also, but he uses more passages than Mr. Bell does. But he talks about the Pharisees and the scribes. The word Pharisees is found like 100 times in the New Testament. And all we can say for certain is that they weren't priests, and the term rabbi was not yet commonly used. So they were teachers and interpreters of the Torah, a scholar class dedicated to the supremacy of the twofold law, the written and the unwritten. Now, the reason I say that now, they believed in the Torah, but also they had
their tradition, and they're going to hold on to their tradition. That's the reason why Jesus condemns them. In the Talmud, the name is used only in opposition to the term Sadducee, and otherwise the Pharisees are called sages or scribes. Now, when we think about the gospel, often speaks of scribes and Pharisees. Notice it says scribes and Pharisees 44 times in the New Testament. That phrase, scribes and Pharisees, is used 44 times together, as though that the two groups were separate groups. And this may not have been the case, but the confusion possibly arose out of difficulties in translation caused by changes in the meanings of the word, because the way that they had the Bible is that they had scribes who wrote. They made copies of the Bible. So not every scribe was mixed in with that of the Pharisees. And so you'd have others that would also be with those who were scribes. A class of scribes had existed in Judaism probably since the time of Israel, who led the people of Israel back to a strict observance of the law after their return from Babylonian captivity in 538 BC. So the scribes were copyists. And when we were studying the introduction to the New Testament, I asked the question to my class. I said, when John wrote the 7 churches of Asia, how many copies did he make of the book of Revelation? Made 7. When Paul wrote to the churches of Galatia, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, 4 congregations, how many copies of Galatia did he write? He's writing a letter to 4 different congregations. John's writing to 7 different congregations. Who got it first? Well, why couldn't they all get one? One apiece. He's written 7 of them, or written 4 of them, and so forth. And you got to remember what did Peter say in 2 Peter 3 in reference to the Paul's epistles? They're hard to understand. That means they had copies. And sometimes we forget they made copies. You just stop for a moment. If you was the elder over there at Ephesus, and they had elders, remember Acts 20, and therefore all of a sudden you got this letter from the Apostle Paul from the Romans, from Rome, from the prison, and say you're an elder, we'll say you're a member of the church at Colossae, would be a better illustration, because he tells the Colossian brethren, you let the Laodiceans read this, and you read the letter to the Laodiceans. We don't have a letter to Laodiceans. It may have been the letter to the Ephesians, because some people say that the letter of Ephesians did not have a title attached to it. And so the letters were passed around. But if you were an elder at Ephesus, would you get rid of your letter that Paul wrote you, or would you have a scribe to make a copy? And not only that, but what was the Ethiopian eunuch? What was he reading from? He wasn't a priest. So we have to stop sometimes. These scribes are very important people. The Greeks, however, still translated the word as gomeritus. That is, a word has not changed its meaning. The term Pharisee, whatever it may have meant, seemed to have applied to these scribes at first in a derogatory way. Just as Christians seem to have arisen as the term, the word Christian just has arisen as a term for abuse for Jesus' early followers in Antioch, Acts chapter 11, verse 26. Other terms are used in the gospel to make clear to us in reference to them that the Pharisees were, and to describe their functions to those unfamiliar with the Palestinian Judaism. They are those who were skilled in the law, and they were teachers of the law. Luke 5 and verse 17. That's what they were. And so scribes are mentioned about 66 times in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 19, verse 35, we find that the town clerk is called, that's what he's called. And was the word for scribe. That word that we get our word grammar from, Grammateus. It appears that the scribes in the New Testament did the same thing that the scribes in the Old Testament did. The Jewish scribes were frequently against the Lord, Matthew chapter 20, verse 18. Some of them were dishonest, Matthew 12, verse 38. And they did not teach with the kind of authority that Jesus had taught, Matthew 7, verse 29. And so some scribes became members of the Lord's church. You read Matthew 13, 52. They believed on him. It is likely that their skills were used to make copies of the scriptures. And so when Jesus set forth scribes in Matthew 23, 34, they most likely did the work of scribe. So this is evident because of the definition of that word, scribe. So according to Josephus, who had been one, who may have been a Pharisee,
says, considered the most authoritative in their explanation of the law and esteemed as a leading, can't read the name, sect, S-E-C-T. So Jesus said they were, Jesus said they sat on Moses' seat, and he urged people to follow their teachings, but not their practices. Matthew 23. So the Pharisees could actually, as we look at the Sadducees, they were very conservative. But if we look at the Pharisees, they were very liberal in their day. So it's a contrast in reference to them. They accepted the books of the prophets as authoritative scripture along with the Torah, though most were not yet prepared to canonize the writings. There was those miscellaneous books like Esther and Psalms and Proverbs and Daniel and several others of those books. The Pharisees really placed great stress on a continuing oral interpretation of the scripture. Continue. So therefore, if they continue, they mean what? They change. They can change. Continue in reference to the interpretation of it. And so there'd be changes, new insights were achieved. Jesus referred to this body of oral law, which eventually became the Mishnah and was incorporated into the Talmud, as we've said, when he criticized the Pharisees for teaching human precepts, as we would find in Mark chapter 7, verses 6 and 8, in place of the commandments of God that they had to follow. And so they had the interpretation of that of the law. The Pharisees welcomed new rituals that are not ordained by the Torah and thus not observed by the Sadducees. And so they celebrated Hanukkah, established in 164 BC, by the Maccabees to commemorate the cleansing of the temple from its defilement under King Antiochus before the Epiphany. And Purim, they just recently, wasn't it, here a few months ago, they celebrated Purim, P-U-R-I-M, the joyous reenactment of the Jewish release by Esther. And the practice of baptizing proselytes is Pharisaic as much as Jewish doctrine about angels, the demons, and the Messiah, and the bodily resurrection. So one scholar had described modern Judaism as the moment of the Pharisees. So in Jesus' day, we had the Pharisees themselves. They were divided. Now, they were divided, as I said before, in reference to the question about marriage is one of them. But they were divided into two strongly opposing groups, which had arisen in the generation immediately before Jesus' lifetime. And so one of them was headed by Hillel, H-I-L-L-E-L, and he took a fairly lenient view of the law and a conciliatory stance in most controversies, whether with Gentiles or even with that of other Jews. Scholars have long recognized that Jesus' teaching closely resembled that of Hillel, who formulated the so-called negative golden rule: do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Then you had Gamaliel, who advised the Sanhedrin to consider carefully what you propose to do to these men in Acts chapter 5, was a follower of Hillel, whose opinions were in the minority at the time. Because again, remember, the Sadducees were in control. Paul was a student of Gamaliel and thus indirectly influenced by Hillel. And the other one was Shamai. Now, if you ever get into a discussion about marriage and divorce and remarriage, then these two names come up. And I don't have, what they say, but those names will come up. Because like I said now, Hillel was fairly lenient, had a lenient view of the law. But Shammai, whose intolerance of contact with Gentiles led him to advocate a stricter interpretation of the Mosaic law. And so that becomes a discussion of what Deuteronomy 24 actually says, and other passages in the Old Testament about marriage. And so combining with the more radical anti-Roman factions who did not hesitate to use violence, Shammai party was controlled, won control of the Sanhedrin during Jesus' lifetime. So not until after the destruction of the temple in 70 did the moderate views of Hillel become dominant. And so you have to study, again, those two to try to understand the world at that time in reference to these two different ideas.
In AD, after AD 70, the terms Pharisee and scribe dropped out of common usage to be replaced by rabbi. Now, we do see the word master, teacher, and we see the word rabbi. But we find less emphasis on parties and factions in Judaism after AD 70. And again, remember, Sadducees just lost out. So once the center of their worship had been removed, all Jews became concerned with the problem of ensuring survival of their faith. I recall it was some years ago when they did a lectureship on Judaism, and somebody got in touch with one of the Jewish rabbis, and asked him and said, since you can't go to Jerusalem and worship in the temple, and you can't offer sacrifices anymore like you used to offer, how is it that you get forgiveness for your sins? And he made the observation, he said, if it's not through prayer, we don't have forgiveness of our sins. Because you remember, every time they sinned, they had to offer sacrifice. And plus, they had the Day of Atonement. So the spiritual leaders who survived the fall of Jerusalem gathered the little town called Jamina, J-A-M-N-I-A, in western Judea, and set themselves to study the Torah. And the exact role of this council was in the development of a post-destruction Judaism is still not clear. But after 70, the Jews were not troubled by splits like those between the Sadducees and the Pharisees anymore. And even today, you have the different ones. You know, you have the conservative, you have the liberal, and so forth. But not like it was back then. Any questions? See, I'm not going to finish. So let me see how much. Let's do the Herodians and we'll stop. The groups we discussed so far now was essential religious. Okay, Pharisees and Sadducees. They're essential religious. Now, again, the Sadducees did have considerable political influence because they were in charge. The other Jewish factions mentioned in the New Testament had predominantly a political overtones, and that was the Herodians. They were more a political than a religious party. They were Jews who attached themselves to the political fortunes of the Herodian family. And a lot of times in our Bibles, sometimes they will give a list of the Herodian family. And so they attached themselves, hoping therefore to promote the interests of the Jewish people. So they were loose in observing the rituals of Judaism. And though in this respect they were the opposite of the Pharisees, they easily fell in with them in efforts to ruin Jesus, cause him problems. But some suppose that the Herodians were all Sadducees, that they belonged to what is known as the B-O-E-T-H-U-S-I-A-N branch of that body. Now, I don't know if they were or not, but that again is what some people say, that they were a part of the Sadducees and they belonged to this little split, this little branch off from them. The Boethicians, I guess is the way you say that, B-O-E-T-H-U-S-I-N. Now, the Herodians apparently were a party favoring the restoration of one of Herod's descendants to that of the throne. Now, Herod's son Antipas was tetrarch of Galilee. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read the New Testament, I have a hard time keeping up with who's who and where are they. Okay, so I have in my Bible a chronology that I've made up that we give in our book on the book of Acts and plus Introduction to the New Testament. So we try to keep up with some of these folks. But Herod's son, like I say, he was a tetrarch of Galilee between 4 BC and 39 AD. During Jesus' lifetime, while another son, Philip, ruled Iturea and Trachonitis, that's east of Galilee, between 4 BC and 34 AD. Now, when we read the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because we don't have a lot of that in John, but in those accounts, the Herodians are always mentioned in connection with the Pharisees, but it seems again that to have been the Pharisees who initiated the contact. And perhaps it was an effort to gain political allies. And also, the Pharisees were against Jesus. And Herod Antipas, however, was deeply concerned about Jesus because of his connection with John the Baptist. Mark 6 and verse 16, so whom Antipas had beheaded. And so he may have been willing to cooperate with the Pharisees because in their opposition to Jesus, because he thought that Jesus was John the Baptist resurrected. And if that be the case, it would seem something like he would have some type of Pharisaic leanings, would it not, about the resurrection? Luke's gospel never mentions the Herodians. Even in passages which parallels Luke, you can get a parallel gospel, and you can look at Luke 6, 1 through 11, and none of them are mentioned, but the parallel passage, Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, and they are mentioned. So Luke is the only evangelist to relate that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas during the deliberations over his fate. And since Jesus was a Galilean, Pilate hoped to evade a decision on technicality. But Antipas questioned Jesus and then allowed his soldiers to mock him, to abuse him before sending him back to Pilate. Then Luke reports that this led to a reconciliation between Antipas and Pilate because of what was happening. So the point of the story is obscure as in Luke's motive for omitting any references to the Herodians' opposition to Jesus. And one possibility may be that by absolving Herod and his party, that is Rome's allies, from blame, he fixes the heavier fault of Jesus' execution of the Jewish populace and the Pharisees. Now, these Herodians must have been pleased with Agrippa the First, that is Herod's grandson, when he was made king of Judea in 41 by his friend, the new emperor, Claudius. But Agrippa died 3 years later. And you know what happened to him? He died actually August 44. That's according to Josephus. And he burst open, eaten up with worms. Was that right? In the book of Acts, chapter 12, verses 20 through 23. And the province reverted to that of being governed by the Roman Agrippa II. Eventually, he ruled over various northern territories. That would include Galilee, but Judah remained under direct Rome control. And so we hear no more of the Herodian party. A couple of the church fathers thought that the Herodians believed that Herod was the Messiah. But this mistaken assumption was an attempt to fill a void when they lacked a solid foundation of solid information. And so there was that problem. Okay, we will begin with the zealots. Okay. Now, let me see here. The zealots. Let me make it some color so I won't forget. We'll make it blue. Any questions? Let's see. Y'all have any questions, comments?
No, just wondering how you're feeling.
I can tell you what I told the doctor when she asked me that with my hands. I'm feeling all right. Everything was clear. Even my nuclear test, I have no infection, but they can't explain why I keep getting infection. They said I probably have to end up taking antibiotics the rest of my life. Have to switch off. I was taking like 14 days and switch off to another one, a very low dose. That's my outside doctor. I get to see my VA doctor next Thursday, matter of fact. See what
Hopefully they put you on, are you on probiotics and stuff too?
Yeah, I take probiotics, and I had taken some tests in reference to my blood work. And in reference to that, they told me not to be eating like yogurt and stuff like that. But I told the doctor that I was going back on eating that. It was just something I had a sensitivity to it. But I actually need those types of things. And so I won't have to quit the diet thing that they put me on and go back on those things.
Okay. Well, hopefully you're feeling better.
Oh, I am. I feel a lot better. I'm going to Oak Hill and Covington and preach this weekend.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Be
back
safe.
on, as my wife says, the traveling preacher. So. All right, y'all have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Good night.